When Queen Elizabeth I died, virgin, and so with no children, on March 24th, 1603, her closest relative was James, the son of her cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, who Elizabeth ultimately beheaded after Mary had several times threatened her and plotted to take the British throne as well. Mary had been imprisoned since James was only 1 year. He did not even remember her at all as a mother, so there was no need for James to hold grudges or remorse, let alone for Elizabeth naming him as her successor. After centuries of English kings battling and trying to subjugate Scotland, the two kingdoms were finally united under James VI of Scotland and as James I of England. James' sexual orientation was apparent from early age. At 13, he was infatuated with his much older cousin, Esme Stuart, who he later gave the title of Duke of Lennox. An observant from that time wrote that James was so profusely into him that even during this public sight of the people, he would still often cuddle him and kiss him. James had been King of Scotland since the age of 1, but then, after he inherited the throne of England at 36, he was rather still used to the rules of Scotland yet, where the king was above every law and everybody. In England, however, he had this reality check of not being wanted as an absolute monarch. James, of course, hated that of England, especially the fact that he had to take permission from Parliament to collect taxes. Permission he was rarely granted. Famous Elizabethan Sir Walter Raleigh was involved in a plot to remove King James, but he was eventually spotted and found guilty thoroughly. During James I, the British people began to send ships in order to colonize Canada and what is now known as the United States. In fact, the colony which colonized the state of Virginia was named specially for James. But perhaps James' most vivid and lasting legacy was actually the printing of his Bible, named the King James Bible, one of the first written in English. This version had a strong lasting impact on the Protestants. Indeed, it still remains very popular today. James nevertheless had many issues when it came to religion. People with the Catholic faith of Rome never really let go of the aggravation caused by Henry VIII after changing England into a Protestant country. There was almost a massive explosion when a group of Catholic conspirators led by Guy Fawkes smuggled explosive stuff into Parliament in order to blow up King James and everybody else in it. But such plot failed miserably, and therefore all of them were put to death. This past attempt of terrorism is still remembered each year on the 5th of November in England. James had a passionate relationship with his wife, Princess Anne of Denmark, and by whom he even fathered 8 offspring. He happened to have affairs with other women too, but it was expected of the king to do so. It was his male relationships, which he favored, that caused ruckus all over. He was then flamboyantly bisexual, given the fact that he had several male lovers who he gave powerful positions that were even above their skills and knowledge to tackle. One of his lovers, Robert Carr, was convicted of poisoning one time, which caused an outrageous occasion. James had a secret passage to his chambers, linked to another lover, such as George Villiers, who he had appointed as the Duke of Buckingham. George was rather impudent and incompetent at leading, and even though he had still the support of the king, he was regularly impeached by the Lords of Parliament. After King James died, George was left with no protection, and therefore he was eventually stabbed to death by a disgruntled pile of officers. While James was still alive, even those in the growing Protestant faith didn't approve many things. As a matter of fact, James was a hypocrite. He insisted on severe and deadly punishment for sodomy and homosexuality amongst his people, despite he was secretly homosexual and bisexual himself his whole life. James died at 58 after having reigned for 21 years. His tomb at Westminster Abbey in London is consequently even flanked by 2 of his dearest, George Villiers and Esme Stuart.